through a lot of testing and trial and error and such, I've come up with what I think is a formula that works pretty well for building out networks, especially at the early stages when you don't necessarily have a lot of people on it, but you need to get kind of your core infrastructure in place so that you can start adding a lot of endpoints. So the network I have here in Napa, so currently I have 26 active routers, and that's including the gateway. And of those, the operators tools or ops tools considers 13 of them to be relays. And ops tools considers anything to be a relay if it has more than one neighbor, right? So I have things kind of categorized into what I consider to be relays, also meshed endpoints, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. But the point I wanted to make here is that roughly 50% of my network is meshed in, meaning about 50% of the routers on my network have more than one neighbor that they can communicate with, which is quite a bit higher than I think most networks using the same design. So for comparison, in Clatskanie, the network that they have there that has been running longer, it's been running about a year or more, they currently have 111 active routers, and of those, 28 are considered relays. So for them, it's about 25% are meshed, right? So just comparing, these two networks, my network is about twice as meshed as the Clatskanie network. And the reason for that is because of all these challenges and with hills and trees and obstacles and stuff, I'm finding that I really have to make a lot of meshiness in my network so that there's proper failover and so that people are just generally getting good experience, right? The other benefit of having kind of this high mesh ratio is that it gives you a lot of opportunities to test things, to upgrade things, to fix things. Like you can work on the network without kicking a lot of people offline, right? So I have a lot of antennas where I can go out and I can fully upgrade the antenna. Say like I'm upgrading from a light beam to a power beam, something like that. I can upgrade that antenna, do all of that work without warning anybody, because while I've taken that link down, there's another failover that's still operating, so people are still online. The internet might be a bit slower, and also technically it's probably a bit more expensive because they're now having to go through more hops to get to the internet, but it's a temporary thing. I've working on this for 30 minutes or whatever, and it's just not a big deal. So I really, really value that amount of flexibility and the ability to just kind of go work on things and try new things without having to kick everybody offline. So that's nice. So I've started using a couple of standardized terms to classify the different nodes in my network. So first of all, every network's going to have a gateway, and that's where your fiber is or whatever is your main backbone, right? And you can have more than one gateway in a network, but chances are when you're starting out, you're just going to have one. And that's what I have, is a single fiber drop as my gateway. And then from there, I branch out to what I consider to be major relays and then sub relays. So the difference being that a major relay, it's chances are it's connected directly to the gateway, so it's one hop deep, or possibly it's 2 or 3 hops deep if my network's getting really, really deep. But for the most part, it's relatively close to the gateway in terms of the number of hops you have to go, right? So ideally, it's connected directly to the gateway, and it's serving probably something like 10 to 20 or more downstream routers, right? So the single major relay is covering a big percentage of the network. Versus a sub relay, that's something where it's deeper in the network, so chances are it's 2 hops deep, 3 hops deep, even 4, 5, 6, like it can get pretty deep in there. And it's only supplying internet to maybe 5. You could really stretch it and get up to 7 or 10 clients, but it's going to be a small number, right? And so for these different kind of relay classifications, I have different equipment that I've used, and I've found kind of these pairings of equipment that work well together. So I'm just going to kind of go over that. So for a major relay, I'd say probably the most important thing is you want to have that incoming signal from the gateway or wherever you're getting your connection from to be really, really strong. And the best way I found to do that is to use the Ubiquiti power beams. And so I have 2 power beams as a point-to-point, so they're just pointed directly at each other. So one on the gateway, one on my major relay, for example. And you want to use 80 megahertz channel width for that P2P if possible. Now, since I'm in a rural area and there's not a lot of radio interference around, I can use 80 megahertz pretty much anywhere I want. Now, if you're in a more urban area or a suburban area, you may not be able to do that because the wider your channel width, the more you're opening yourself up for radio interference, right? So you're just going to have to kind of look at the spectrum available in your area, which the Ubiquiti dashboard has a nice visual representation of that. There's that big wide line showing the spectrum. The deeper blue it is, the better it is, meaning there's less interference, and the more it turns to kind of like yellow, then or green, kind of the worse it is, right? So, and red is really, really bad. If you see red on the spectrum, definitely avoid that part as much as you can. So, anyway, so again, for a major relay, I've got a power beam point-to-point incoming. I'm using 80 megahertz channel width as much as possible, which the power beams claim they can do 600 plus megabits per second with that type of connection. So you also want to have really good signal strength for your point-to-points. The ideal number is 55. When you see that number of decibels there, right? So if you get it to 55, that's great. Anywhere between 40 and 55 is also good, right? So several of mine are at like 48 or something. That's totally fine. If you're into the 30s or below, that's too loud. It's not going to work well. Even right at 40, you'll see sometimes it'll dip between like 40 and 39. Like you're borderline. So I'd say to be safe, try to aim for like 45 to 55, that range. That's going to be a really nice, strong signal. High 50s to 60, it starts to get weaker. So like if you can't get anything better, somewhere in, say between 58 and 63, like you can get away with that. It'll probably still work well enough. But if you're into kind of the mid to high 60s or 70s or 80s, it's probably just not strong enough to be a big core link, right? That's going to be fine for just a small little endpoint. But again, we're trying to push a lot of traffic through this big link. So you want it to be as good as you can. So the other thing I've found for these major relays is if you have a long cable run, and by long I mean more than 100 feet or so, you want to use Cat6 cable. And of course you still want to use the outdoor rated, UV resistant, shielded, direct burial, you want all those ratings as well. But what I found is that when the cable length is more than about 100 feet, using Cat6 cable really can make a very big difference. I've seen a difference of over 20 megabits per second just upgrading from Cat5e to Cat6. So it's pretty significant, and you want every little bit you can get, right? When the cable runs pretty short, say below 100 feet or so, then I've found Cat5e and Cat6 are pretty much identical. I don't see any performance differences. Now, that's a particular thing that I would love to really game out more. This 100 feet number is kind of an arbitrary thing that I've just made up. It's kind of an intuition. I haven't really hard tested that. So if any of you have the opportunity to test and figure out where exactly that threshold is, where you should justify upgrading from Cat5e to Cat6, I'd love to know that number. I don't know exactly. But as a ballpark, 100 feet seems to be about right. And of course, you need to also respect the maximum distance, which technically I think is 330 feet, but we consider it to be more like 280 to 300 is like really the upper end in terms of good experience, right? So keep your cable length as short as possible. A major relay, since it's handling a lot of downstream clients, you're also going to want a strong outgoing antenna. So most of the time, this is going to be a big sector, meaning a point-to-multipoint antenna, and I primarily use the Prism stations for that. Again, another Ubiquiti antenna. So the Prism stations are, good performance, good coverage, and they're relatively affordable. Now they only do 90-degree spread, which is not that wide. So in some sort of circumstances, you may need more than one Prism station to cover a whole neighborhood, right? So it kind of just depends on what you're trying to hit. But the Prism stations have pretty good performance, compared to the other things that I've tested with. The other option, again, depending on what you're connecting to, is you might also want to have point-to-points outgoing from your major relay. So it just really depends on how many people you're trying to connect and what the topography is. So on one of my major relays here, I have a Prism station that's covering most of the clients. but then I also have, I think, 1 or 2 point-to-points that are going to particular sub-relays, and then those spread out to more clients. So you get this branching kind of effect, right? So you can have a strong incoming signal from your power beam point-to-point, and then you can have a sector going out just covering clients, and then you can also have a couple point-to-points going to other relays, right? And you want those to be nice and strong because they have more clients past them. So the other thing that I found is very important for these major relays is always use the WRT 32X router, right? So that's the upgraded, $200 router, and this is very important. I've seen speed differences between, like with the basic router, about 100 megabits per second, and with this upgraded 32X router, about 200 megabits per second. So literally twice as fast. It's a huge jump when you upgrade to that bigger router. And of course it's more expensive, but for these core relays it's absolutely worth it. So definitely use the 32X router. And then a note on speed tests here, like obviously when you build things you're going to want to be running speed tests at each hop, right, at each node in the network to make sure that the speeds are staying as high as possible. What I found, like I have this 10-year-old computer that I take up onto rooftops and stuff like that. Like if I break it, it's not the end of the world, right? So it's good for installs, but the Wi-Fi card in it and even the Ethernet card in it is not really that great. And so when I run speed tests through that 10-year-old computer, I generally get lower numbers versus when I use a different computer, or actually what I found is my phone. When I use my phone to run speed tests, especially on the 5 gigahertz Wi-Fi networks, I get much, much faster results. So just keep in mind that when you're testing the speed on these things, one of the factors is the speed of the network card in your phone or tablet or laptop or whatever you're using. So it's a good idea to have kind of a cheap laptop for field work, but you may want to either rely on your phone or on a fancier laptop with a better network card in order to do these speed tests. And of course, you also want to do both hardwired Ethernet speed tests as well as Wi-Fi speed tests. Vast majority of clients are going to use Wi-Fi, so you want to make sure that that's good as well. And if you're having any trouble, if you're finding a significant difference between the hardwire and the Wi-Fi, check the Wi-Fi channels. So there's a free app on Android that I use for this. It's called Net Analyzer, and it will just show you kind of this. It'll show you the different channels for 2.4 and 5 gigahertz Wi-Fi, and you can see if there's a lot of things stacked up on one channel, then that's bad. You want to avoid that, right? So, and that's generally just going to be interference from neighboring Wi-Fi networks and things like that. Moving on to sub-relays. So a sub-relay is something that I would consider, it'll handle something like 5 to 10 downstream clients, and really 10 is pushing it. I would say I try to keep it at 5 wherever possible. I might let it grow up to 7 or 8 or something clients, but you really want to keep it a small number. And the reason for that is because I use the light AP sectors as the outgoing on a sub-relay. And the light APs, I'm using the basic model, not the GPS one. So the basic model, they're pretty cheap, and the performance is not that great. They have a really wide spectrum that they put out. They say it's 120 degrees, but I mean it's closer to 180 degrees. It's really wide, and we call them dirty radios because they're pretty dirty. They cause a lot of interference to anything around them. So with the light APs, you really have to be careful to choose the spectrum that you're using. So for all these antennas throughout the network, you should definitely be manually choosing your spectrum for all of them. Don't rely on the auto channel or the auto whatever. The auto thing doesn't work that well from what we've seen. So just manually specify your spectrum. In the most case, I'm just breaking up the spectrum into 3 big chunks: high, medium, and low. Meaning high being like the 5.8s, or mediums being like around 5.5, and low being around 5.1, something like that. And so for a sub-relay, chances are you're going to have your incoming antenna and your outgoing light AP on the same pole, right? That's usually the simplest way to install it. which means that there's a lot of potential for that light AP to interfere with your incoming connection, right? So you want to make sure they're set at opposite ends of the spectrum. So for that kind of thing, I would do, for example, the incoming at 5.8 and the outgoing at 5.1 is like totally opposite ends of the spectrum. Or reverse those, it doesn't matter. As long as they're spaced out, that's fine. And now if you're in an area with a lot of interference, a lot of other signals around, they may have to be closer together. But you just want to make them as far apart as possible, is what I found to work well. So for a sub-relay, chances are I'm using a light AP as my outgoing sector. For the incoming, now I'm still going to prefer a power beam point-to-point for that incoming. If it's feasible to do that, that's what I'd rather do. And in some cases, I also have a power beam for the incoming connected to a prism station on the outgoing of a major relay. Okay, so we'll spell that out a little more. So for my major relay, had power beam point-to-point incoming and a prism station outgoing, right? Now for a sub-relay, I might have a power beam incoming, but that power beam is connected to the prism, right? And then it's now has a smaller light AP outgoing. And that's been working pretty well, but definitely if you have the option and you can afford it, do that sub-relay incoming as a power beam point-to-point as well. It's just definitely going to be better. The main reason being, well, there's a couple reasons for that. One of them is that the sectors, this is true for the light APs and the prism stations, all of them, they only do 40 megahertz channel width, which is half of 80, which means that they can only ever be, at their peak performance, they can only ever be about half as fast as a power beam point-to-point at 80 megahertz. So we're talking 300-ish megahertz, 300-ish megabits per second throughput compared to 600-ish. And in most cases, that may not be a huge deal, but again, you just want to make every link as strong and fast as possible, right? And so that's a good reason to make sub-relays incoming be a power beam point-to-point. And also, you can kind of make some judgment calls based on the clients that are going to be downstream of this. Like, if I'm setting up a sub-relay that I know is primarily providing internet for a lot of retirees, and I know that they're not really using the network very heavily, then in that case I might be able to get away with just a light beam point-to-point, or a light beam to a prism station or something like that. So you can kind of make some judgment calls. Like, if this little wing of your network is going to be low data use, then you can probably get away with cheaper equipment, right? But if you've got families with kids, especially all the teenagers doing video games and stuff like that, people working from home, that kind of thing, you definitely want to have it be strong. So power beam incoming, light AP outgoing. That's my general formula for a sub relay, but you can make some judgment calls there too. And then also for the outgoing, depending on where you're sending the signal, you may also want to have a couple point-to-points outgoing, right? So you might have a situation where you've got a light AP outgoing that's handling, say 3 to 5 clients that are just right there across the street. But then also you've got 1 or 2 light beams outgoing that are handling, clients that are far away. And that would be like a light beam point-to-point. And that's fine, you can do that. Again, be careful to separate the spectrum as much as you can so that you're not getting a lot of crosstalk and interference. But you can definitely do that and make those judgment calls as needed. And those clients that are off of the point-to-points, they're definitely going to have a better connection than the people off the light AP. The light APs, again, we kind of have to use them because they're cheap, but they're not that good in terms of performance. They're okay. The other thing with a sub-relay, let's say I started getting more clients in that immediate neighborhood, and so I was growing from 5 clients to 7 to 10, that kind of thing. Once I'm in that range of 9 or 10 clients, that's where I'm going to start thinking about, okay, I need to upgrade this from being a sub-relay to being a major relay. And what that means is I want to make sure I have a power beam incoming, and I might make that a point-to-point, right? I'm going to make sure my outgoing, I'm going to probably upgrade that light AP to become a prism station, right? Because a single prism station can handle 15 to 20 clients with good performance. So probably I'm going to upgrade that outgoing antenna as well. and the router. Again, for a regular sub relay, if it's relatively low data usage, retired couples, that kind of thing, probably you're fine with the basic router for your sub relay. But when you're getting into more clients, 7 to 10 plus clients, then I'm also going to upgrade that router to be the 32X because it just handles traffic better. So pretty much everything I'm going to upgrade if needed. And so that's also an area where when I'm designing a relay, I'm trying to kind of make the call in advance. Like, do I see this relay has the potential to grow to be, say, 15 or 20 clients? Or is this kind of always going to be just 3 to 5 people? If it's always going to be 3 to 5, I'm going to use the cheaper stuff and just let it be as it is. But if I think it has the potential to grow, then probably what I'm going to do is make the incoming link strong from the get-go, and the outgoing I'll upgrade it in time when it makes sense to do so, that kind of thing. So because it's always a gamble. Like I've definitely had some where I kind of put all my eggs in this basket, spent a lot of money on this relay to make it strong, and then a couple months later other people just haven't really signed up, and I don't really want to go back and downgrade a relay. I mean, you can, but it's kind of, I don't know, it doesn't feel right to do that. So it's a gamble. Like that's why it financially kind of makes sense to start with the cheaper equipment and upgrade over time, but also keep in mind that you're then duplicating labor. If you're doing it yourself and you're kind of not charging yourself for labor, maybe that's not a big deal. But if you're paying a contractor for labor, or you want to actually be paid for your time, then it may be cheaper just to use the expensive stuff at the get-go so you don't have to upgrade it later, right? So things to consider there. So now let's talk about failovers and meshing. So with failover, what I mean is that if one link goes down, like let's say I've got a power beam point-to-point that's processing a bunch of traffic, and something happens and it stops working. One of the antennas just locks up or whatever, or the wind comes and skews one of the antennas so it's not aimed right anymore, or something like that. If that link goes down for any reason, you still want your network to run. You want it to do something still. So the main way I've been doing that is I've been using light beam point-to-points as a failover. So let's say this is a major relay. I'm coming from my gateway to a major relay, and I've got 15, 20 something downstream clients off of that. So I'm going to have a power beam point-to-point, 80 megahertz channel width, and that's going to be my primary link that's handling most of that traffic. But on the same poles, I might have 2 light beam point-to-points, right? So I've got 2 point-to-points facing each other like that. And now the light beams, if I can get away with them being 80 megahertz, then I will. And again, separate the spectrum so they're not interfering with each other. But if the spectrum's kind of busy there, you don't have the space for it, the light beams could be 40 megahertz, and that's okay. So basically you've got like a 600-ish megabit per second primary link, but if it fails over to this, I don't want to do my middle finger, it fails over to this 40 megahertz channel width, 300 megabits per second-ish secondary link, right? So effectively, in that failover situation, your network has gotten half as fast, right? So you've lost half the speed, which is a bad thing, but at least you're still online. And that's the most important thing, right? So again, if you can, 2 light beams point-to-point can do 80 megahertz channel width, and they still claim to be able to process 600 megabits per second. I'm not convinced that they actually can handle that amount of traffic, but it's potentially there. So if you can get away with doing 80 for both your primary and your failover, great, do it. If you can't, then do 80 for the primary and 40 for the failover, and that's okay too. And then for the signal strength, I think I mentioned before, you want it to be kind of in the 40s to mid 50s, right? 55 is ideal. Anywhere in the 45 to 55 range is great. It's going to work really well. Try to aim for that if at all possible. You also definitely need to look at the delta, the modulation. You'll see that little triangle stands for delta. You see the delta and then a number, right? Ideal is delta 0. That's perfect. So if you can get it to be 0 and like stable at 0, great. If it's 1, 2, or 3, that's okay. If it starts swinging into the 4, 5, or plus higher numbers, that's bad. And so since I'm doing a lot of these shots where there's some tree obstruction, so like I'm I'm not shooting through the center of the trees or the center of a forest because it just won't work. But in a lot of these shots, I'm shooting through kind of the fringe edge of a tree, right? Like a couple limbs of a tree, that kind of thing. And what you'll find there is that the delta or the modulation will kind of fluctuate. It'll swing up and down a bit, and you can tell if it's a bit of a windy day. As the wind picks up, you'll see that delta swing more, and it's just because the tree branches are blowing around through the middle of your signal. Sometimes that's just unavoidable, and you have to deal with it. And the generally, I'm going to get it as best as I possibly can. The other thing I found is I have a couple links where I'm shooting from a building rooftop to another building rooftop, but I'm shooting over a highway. And most of the time, that link is good. I'll get like a delta, 0, 1, or 2, something like that. But then every time a semi truck drives by, it'll swing up to like delta 5, delta 6, delta 8, something like that, right? Because a semi truck is just a big piece of sheet metal, right, that is blocking the signal. And even though the center of my beam, say it's 15 feet up and it's above the roof of the semi truck, well, the Fresnel part of the beam, the fat part of it, that is being blocked partially by that semi truck as it drives by. And in some cases, this is just unavoidable. You can't necessarily get the antennas high enough in the air to not have that be a problem. And so what I found in those cases is like it's generally still fine. It's not that big a deal. It's going to depend on the amount of traffic on that road. So if I have to shoot across like more of a residential road, and I see a little bit of modulation as cars drive by, it's not great, but probably it's going to be okay. But if it's like a busy highway or freeway where it's just constant traffic, then it could be an issue, right? And what that results in, when you see those modulation swings, the deltas going up and down, is for someone who's actually using the internet, basically what that means is that their latency or their ping time is going up and down. And so if someone's just browsing the web or checking email, they're not even going to notice, right? But if you're doing something like gaming or VoIP calls, video chats, that kind of thing, synchronous type of activities, you probably will notice, and you'll get this kind of laggy experience where like it's good, it's fast for a bit, and then there's this bit of lag, and then it catches up again, right? We're all used to that kind of thing. So that's those modulation swings, those delta swings, those are going to cause that kind of glitchy or laggy performance, right? So you definitely want to avoid that if you can. You want your delta to be steady. And even if you're forced to have a link with not an ideal delta, like let's say you're at delta 4, it's not ideal, but it's okay. If it's steady at 4, that's better than it fluctuating. One where it's like it fluctuates between 2 and 5. That fluctuating is probably going to be worse, right? Because you'd rather have an internet connection that's a little bit slower but consistent versus one that's like kind of variable, fast and slow, right? So definitely be aiming for low deltas and steady, consistent deltas whenever you can. Sometimes it's unavoidable, but just do the best you can.